It's a time of corona, no one cares, they just want to get on with it.
Well, hi everybody and welcome to Savage Reads. I am Louise Savage, Simon's mum, and I'm really excited because I've been busy reading the Women's Prize Longlist and it's been an absolute delight. I can't tell you, it's the hardest decision I've ever had to make to whittle them down to 6. But anyway, over to you, Simon.
Oh, I feel like I'm out in the field when I'm clearly not. For those of you who've been watching this channel for any length of time, you'll know that me and Mum have been reading, well, we started doing it last year actually, where we read the long list together and we did a video about the shortlist, and then we did a video of our favourites in order. So what we're going to do is, to tease you all, we'll let you know which 6 make our personal shortlist, but we're not going to tell you in what order. Neither of us know what the shortlist is. We're going to talk about them in alphabetical order, but as Mum said, this has been the toughest choice I've done this now I think for about 10 years, and this is the hardest long list I've had to whittle down. They're so good.
They're brilliant, and you know, I kept reading one thinking, oh, this is my favourite, and then I'd read another one, it's like, no, this is, and it really is impossible. I don't know how the judges are going to do it.
But I also want to put a caveat in, I haven't finished every single book. There's one I haven't read any of, and then there's I think 4 that I'm reading some of, but it might be more. But I've read at least 100 pages of every book, bar 2, 3. And there's reasons for that, which I'll talk about shortly.
So the first book, alphabetically, I'm just rummaging down here, is Gin Patrol.
On the Purple Line.
Oh yeah, On the Purple Line. I kept forgetting about the Purple Line. It's very important.
By Deepa and Apara. Mum, what did you think about this book?
I absolutely loved it. I just thought it's told from the point of view of a 9-year-old boy who turns himself into a detective because various children go missing. And I just found it, I thought that, I often find when narrators write from the point of view of a young child, there'll be something at some point that grates on me. But I thought the voice was consistent all the way through. It's really believable. It's set in the Basti, the sort of, what would you call it, the slum areas, I suppose, of Mumbai, and you feel like you've been there, you know, you really do feel like you've travelled to that place. And I like the way that it's a book with a social conscience as well, but very honest, because it's funny, you know, it's witty and it's clever and it's poignant and it's sad, and I really, really love this book.
So this was the one that I've left till last, so I've only read about 110 pages of it. But it gave me an instant what I call a book tingle, where you start reading a book and you're like, I know I'm going to love this book. And it's partly because there's quite a magical, ghostly, supernatural edge to it, which is very much from the start, which I really like. But also, I think it's like you said, it's very honest and it's very frank, but it's very vivid and colourful and rich as you're reading, which I really, really loved. So, is this on your shortlist or not? This is so exciting, I can't get over it. It's ridiculous.
This is one that I really agonised over. Couldn't, because there were others. So, it doesn't have a tick on the back.
Controversially, even though I've not finished it, mine does.
Ah, that's interesting.
And there's something about this book when I started reading it where I was like, actually, there's just something here that's really rich, quite different. And I think as well, personal taste, I love books set in India. Yeah. So that's the first one.
I'm really about that because I was so wanted to. So I'm dead chuffed that one of us has.
Right, next up is Fleischmann is in Trouble by Taffy Brodesser-Akner. Now, I have DNF'd this twice because I think it wants to do what Larry's Party did in being a book told from a male perspective that is really about gender stereotyping and feminism, but in a different way. But there's something about it that's jarred with me, both physically and now on audio.
I DNF'd it as well.
Really?
I think our taste is getting more similar as you get older. Oh, and I get older. I found it tortuous, and I was just reading list sentence after list sentence after. I'm afraid I got bored. Now, it may just be, I think sometimes it's the time when you read a book. I might come back to it in a year or two and think it's great. But I didn't get very far with it at all. I tried and tried, but I just kept switching off.
And so for me, it's Sad face.
No tick on mine.
Right, next, Mum. What's next?
Next up is Queenie by Carty-Williams.
And it's about a woman called Queenie who is having a kind of breakdown, really, because she's really lost. She doesn't feel like she's getting what she wants to in her career. That's kind of stuttered to a halt. She's had a breakup, and it's how she goes back. What I love about this book is how much you love Queenie, but you want to shake her and tell her to sort herself right out, because she does some really frustrating things. She gets into some really difficult situations. She's quite a frustrating narrator, and I think that goes to show how brilliant Candice is at writing, because in a lot of writers' hands she would be irritating and you just wouldn't bother and you'd give up quite quickly. But I really, really, really like this book.
In some ways it's quite brutal as well. Yeah, it's all of those things, and I think the male characters in it are sometimes a bit hard to swallow, aren't they? And it's really witty and warm, and I like the sort of multimedia aspect of it, because it's not all told in prose. There's text messages and there's, you know, emails and that kind of thing. So, you know, I think it's a really, really good read. Really, you know, I definitely enjoyed it at the time, and it left me with a real sort of feeling of warmth.
Yeah. It looks like Shero's reading it right now. But sadly, I would have loved to put it on the shortlist, but I haven't. And any other year, this could easily have been on there.
You're just taking the words out of my mouth. That's
Sorry.
Exactly what I'm saying. You know, if it's been a different year, but no, it got squeezed out by other things.
This is another one that I have not finished. I'm that far in.
Then, because I have. She marries and moves from the Dominican Republic to New York in the 1960s, and it's just, I loved her perspective. She's perched right at the top of this building, and she's overlooking a cinema and various other things, and she's gradually unpicking and making sense of this very, very, what is to her a very alien place. And to us as readers, it's really iconic. And also the whole sort of idea of America, the New York in the 60s, and the sort of, you know, the hippie movement and all those sorts of things. This is a very, very, very different version of New York in that period of time. And I thought the character of Anna was so, so easy to empathise with. And she's soft, but she's strong. And I thought the male characters in it were fascinating, and what it had to say about family and about male masculinity was really important. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
So this might be our first disagreement, because I don't find her easy to empathise with. I don't feel like I know her. So I don't know, that's not true. I feel like I know her, but I don't feel I have any emotional link to her whatsoever. This book to me reads I feel constantly at distance. I feel like it's a Netflix show rather than a book in book form. It's reading like a screenplay rather than a novel.
So I find that fascinating, because I didn't get that at all. And I feel as though I have paced up and down that room with her and cooked those meals with her. What's fascinating about what you've just said is that as I was reading it, I was being reminded of View from the Bridge, the play.
Oh, that's interesting.
So maybe, I don't know, I just think that's interesting that you sort of likened it to Netflix or whatever. Maybe it has got that.
But at the moment, sadly.
But I did. It's going into me. And what's really interesting is that I kept switching this with Gin Patrol. Going round and round, and I kept kicking one out, putting one back in, but in the end this was the one that I plumped for. Yeah, I loved it.
Well, there we go. Then we move on to, do you want me to introduce this one, or do you want to introduce
this?
Yeah,
no, you can, that's fine.
So this is Actress by Anne Enright. This is all about a young woman who is telling us the story of her mother, who was a famous Hollywood and Broadway actress. She's Irish, and you start to find out about how she went crazy is basically the premise of it. And I was a little bit nervous because I read The Green Road by her and only loved one particular section. She's that I found the whole book quite melodramatic.
It didn't do it for me at all. I found it felt very, the style of it was very kind of stream of consciousness. Sometimes I wasn't quite sure who was being referred to, or maybe that's just me, you know. And I didn't really care about the subject matter. I think that was my biggest problem with it. For some reason, I couldn't engage with the characters. That was my problem with it.
That's really interesting, because I actually love the cast of characters around the main characters, possibly more than I do the mother and daughter. That said, for me still, it's not a shortlister for me.
Yeah,
so now we move on to Girl, Woman, Other, which I feel like I've talked about a lot on this channel, and we'll be talking about again next Thursday when me and lovely Melanie Sykes do our book club on the 30th. But this was my book of 2019, which slightly gives away what camp it might end up in, possibly. But this is set over 5 chapters, 4 of which are made up of 3 different individual women who are telling us their stories. And slowly but surely, all the stories start to interweave, and you realise you're getting a history of what it's like to have been a black woman since early 1900s. There's no point me hiding it, love this book. I think it is utterly incredible. And there will be a riot from me if this isn't on the actual shortlist. Mum!
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely adored it. I was blown away by it. It's the way that you've got all these really apparently disparate women, and yet they're all interleaved as well. And it's just the richness of it and the humanity of it. And I mean, I think it's a masterpiece. I think I don't really want to say much more about it. I just think it's a wonderful creation.
I love the fact you can never work out, even when you try and start to predict how characters will interlink, how they interlink.
No, that's right. No, you couldn't.
Great. And also the fact that
because you don't in real life.
No.
You know, that's we are all interconnected, aren't we, in lots of ways, but we're not aware. And it's her writing is beautiful. I mean, it's lyrical, and it's.
Well, also, when you look at it, you think it might be hard because it looks a bit like poetry, but it's not. You get the voices. They're all really distinct voices, which for 12 voices is quite a thing to do. Yeah. So obviously from me, it's going on my show.
And from me as well.
Oh, thank goodness. Otherwise, I would be having to disown you. Could you introduce this one, Mum?
Yeah, I will. It's Nightingale Point by Luann Goldie. So it's set in a tower block. It involves predominantly 4 characters, but lots of others as well. And I loved this book too. I couldn't put it down. I think it's a brilliant sort of, I don't know, summer read. The subject material is really distressing and sad, but the characters are warm and wonderful, and what I really liked was there's a real range of ages in this novel that are central to it. I really engaged with it, and it's one of those books that is still very, very much in my head. Those characters are still walking around with me, and that always says something to me. I thought it was a dream, really. Yeah.
I love her writing and I love her characters, and this book will stay with me, and I think it is an incredible read. The plot twist, or the big moment, I am still struggling with, which is interesting.
Okay.
I couldn't work out if I found it believable enough or not, which is really silly because in fiction there's no boundaries to what's believable and what's not. But that to me shows there's a bit of a glitch for me, because I couldn't quite. I believed it as I was reading it, but at the same time when it happened, I was a bit like, What I think she does brilliantly, like you said, is she creates these characters who are so vivid and who are so real. I hate the term walk off the page, but they genuinely do. They live in your head. You feel like you know them. And also what she's really good at, which I kind of wanted a little bit more of actually, was at the beginning she gives you quite a lot of their backstory and a lot of their sort of motivations without it being heavy-handed. And I actually wanted even more of that before the big... Right. Well, I love the fact that you put a you don't put a stereotype on them exactly, but you start to think these characters are going to go one way, and then they totally don't. Which
they're very real because they're unpredictable. There's so much in this book about what love genuinely is. You know, I think it manifests itself in this novel in lots of different and very, very plausible ways. It really chimes for me with the way that people genuinely feel and interact with each other, and it's interesting reading it at a time of national crisis as well.
Yeah, it gives you hope in people. I think it's quite and also reminds you not to judge people by what you may instantly think. I think it's very clever. But on that note, sadly for me, it didn't make it.
I want it in there.
I can say this as you did with Gym Patrol. I'm pleased you've picked it because one of us has picked it.
Yeah.
Right, now then, I want you to introduce this one because I'll say something in factually wrong, probably.
Anyway, so this is Natalie Haynes' 1,000 Ships, and I eagerly awaited this book because I'm a big fan of Natalie, particularly her stand-up for classics that she does. I don't know whether you're probably not aware, but I am actually a classicist. It's what I studied at university.
Oh, it's mentioned on this channel.
What an amazing achievement, because she has given voice to all the female characters from the Trojan War, and not just simply from the works of Homer, but from wherever they pop up in Greek literature. And I was ready to be disappointed because it's such a big ask of somebody to create a book like this. But the characterization is superb. I really loved it. I thought it was very clever. Yeah, I could go on for about an hour. I'll hand over to Simon.
No, I also really, really loved it. This is what I wanted from Silence of the Girls last year, and was quite frustrated with it for not doing. She does everything well. But what I also love is there's a real sprinkling of fun humour. It's brilliantly written. Like there's one bit, it's the is it Calliope?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yes.
And she's a muse and there's a goddess, and there's one point where she literally just says something about, I haven't really been thinking about Helen because I don't like her very much. And it's literally just this, there's this real joy and wryness to it, as well as it being incredibly moving, very difficult to read in parts because it's about the things that it's about war and what happened. I really, really, really loved it. Really, really loved it. That much.
Oh. So I want it in there too.
Okay, this is How We Disappeared by Jing-Jing Lee, and so it's hard to explain this one because it starts off in 2000 when we meet Wang Di, she's just been bereaved. She's having to leave the accommodation she'd done with her husband, and she's thinking about stuff she didn't tell him. And then we skip over to Kevin, who is a young boy who he's quite ostracised, really badly bullied. And he has started recording things, which is kind of his coping mechanism. And he actually records his grandma saying something that nobody should know. And in between these, we go back to 1942 when Singapore was being invaded, and we find out what happened to Wang Di and how all of these events and the secrets that have been kept and how these lead to these two characters interlinking. I don't want to spoil it for anybody. It's a book that's set in a period of history I don't know, really, in a country I don't know very much about, so therefore I don't know about its history even more. And it reminded me of the reading experience of when I read Half a Yellow Sun, and was so blown away by the way an author could write about that history, make you really feel like you had lived with these people. And also what I think Jing-Jing Lee does amazingly is she writes about the horrors of war, and really brutal. I mean, this is a triggering book, but does it in a way that isn't voyeuristic. It's handled really delicately, but very brutally. And yeah, I just thought it was incredible.
I would concur with all of that. I think my only reservation is that sometimes I found the prose just a bit too, I think it's slightly overwritten. That's all I would say. I think in places, which is why I didn't put it in my long list, because it just at times just found it that little bit overwrought.
Whereas I did.
Yeah, very good. I'm glad though. You see, I'm glad for the book.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. Right, next up, the most fun we ever had at Claire Lombardo, and this is a big, epic family saga about four sisters, and it goes back to something that happened many years before, where all their lives changed without them really knowing it, and then we go straight into the future where they're kind of the repercussions of really coming to the fore. But also, it's very much about their parents' relationship.
Yes, this is one that I've read most of. I haven't quite finished it, but it's very much a should it be on the list, shouldn't it be on the list one. I absolutely love the family dynamic in it. I don't know whether it's to do with being, there are four sisters in this. I've got two, so I'm one of three girls, and I've also got a brother. So I don't know whether it's something to do with that. But I just find the dialogue and the way that they think and feel about each other just so, that intimacy that you have with siblings, and the way you know which buttons to press, and the way you know when you probably should back off. And I think I am thoroughly entertained by it.
I'm about 200 pages into this, so not quite halfway, and it's having an interesting effect. It's doing something that another book on the Longlist is doing to me, where overall I really like it, and then I have moments where I'm a bit like, why am I reading this? Because there'll be dips. I get real dips in it where I feel like there's too much. Not how can I put it? It's almost like they're throwing everything they physically can, which I love authors to do, but it's almost gets a bit like listy, and there's mundane moments for me. Not that I expect every book to not have those moments, but I just find it occasionally a bit like, why do I need to know that? Why should I care? What's that relevant for? But like you said, I love the dynamic. But sadly for me, it isn't a shortlist book because of the dips. Oh,
and it's not me either. And I think it's one that I, as I say, if I had time, I would sit and read this in one sitting. I don't feel like about the dips.
Because this is the book I'm going to say I haven't read yet, and the reason for that is I was trying to do Mantle in March and read them all in 1 month. Obviously, everything happened in the world, and that went a little bit wrong. And so these aren't, I don't think, necessarily the right books for right now. Or certainly Wolf Hall wasn't. I think they get a bit more digestible, because Wolf Hall's a lot of foundation work. So I haven't got to this yet, but I will do, because I'm currently reading Bring Up the Bodies and want to get to this one once it's done.
I love historical fiction. I love what Hilary Mantel has done with the character of Thomas Cromwell. I think she's made him this amazingly complex man who she's given a real sort of humanity to. I haven't actually physically read it. I've listened to it on Audible, which is a fairly new experience for me, and I have loved it. I've been listening to it while I've been gardening. I mean, you can't. You're talking about Henry VIII, and you're talking about his wives and his relationship with the church, and and how Thomas Cromwell navigates that whole political minefield. And you can't argue that this is a work of genius. She's brilliant.
Originally, I had got this on my shortlist, but I in the end didn't put it on my shortlist.
I didn't either, and I think one of the reasons I didn't, I was trying to work it out, and I think it's something to do with it being a trilogy.
Yeah, possibly.
I think you could very easily read this without having read the others.
There's quite a lot of nods back to the others that I've heard.
Yeah, and it's that whole thing of like, there should almost be that feel that there's like an umbilical cord between the three books.
Yeah.
And I realised I've probably got an issue with trilogies and prizes. I don't know.
I want you to introduce this one because this was one of your favourite books of last year. No spoilers.
It was, and I as I said at the time, or in that video that we made, or whatever, I thoroughly loved it. Whatever.
I'm off. Whatever.
It's Edna OBrien writing about the girls who were seized by Boko Haram, and she very courageously went out to that part of the world and did lots and lots of research. I know there's been criticism perhaps of how that research was used, but I you know, she's raised the plight of these girls. She's written about it beautifully, and I found the book intensely moving, and it didn't go to the obvious places. That's one of the things I loved about it. It felt as though it's a novel, but it felt like witness testimony as well, which I thought was really clever, and to my mind seemed very fair. I think it's a really, really important book.
So I read this the other day and read it in one sitting, which is quite a visceral way to do it. It's not a book you're ever going to forget. And I thought the way she handled this young woman's situation, she does seem very clever, because from the beginning, you know she's escaped and she's got a child. So you know that you're going to get what she's been through, which you kind of psychologically build yourself up for, because you know it's going to be horrific. I don't think you can ever prepare yourself for how awful some of the stuff in this book is. It is so shocking and so brutal. And I think what she does, which is really interesting and I thought was very powerful, is look at aftermath and how it is once you've got out of there. And it reminded me of both Sarah Collins' The Confessions of Franny Langton and also Yvonne Battle-Felton's Remembered, because it looks at freedom in a very different way. Like, you know, I like to think of freedom as being this really hopeful, incredible thing, and actually it's terrifying and it can be alienating. My slight quibble with it was, and I put all of the research stuff to one side, because I agree with you, what she's done here is brought the plight of these girls to our attention, and I think that is important. It's the sort of book that you read and go away shocked that that's really happened, but also go and Google and find out more about. My issue is where I think you found one of the strengths. It felt occasionally a bit like witness testimony witness testimony verbatim, rather than having, I thought she could have weaved that. It became too often an occurrence for me where it would be like, oh, and this person's now going to tell me their tragic story, which is awful, but there's no emotional thing there because there's no rapport between the characters.
I felt that propped up the narrative.
I think for me, it felt like I just did this thing where I was like, oh, here's the italic section again. And that kind of just didn't work for me. Hence why I think it is an incredible, incredible book, but not on my shortlist.
And not on mine either, it might surprise you.
I am shooketh.
I know. But it's because it's such a strong list.
I am shooketh to my core.
Oh, I knew you would be. I'm pretty shocked myself.
I'm going to struggle to talk about this book and not cry.
Okay, I'll do it then.
I've not, yes.
So it's Maggie O'Farrell. It's called Hamlet. It is the story of Shakespeare's wife and son, essentially, but also the whole sort of family. What's really interesting is that Shakespeare's rarely referred to directly, so it could be anybody's story.
He's never referred to. It's really interesting, ever, not once.
I just think it's stunning, this book. It writes about grief in a way that I have never encountered before. The sort of, it's not, what's the word? It's not romanticized. It's not, the whole way that she talks about grief is so plausible and so real, I felt. I loved everything about this novel. I think the writing, the use of imagery, and the way that nature plays such an important part in the story. The setting, again, you know, I can really visualise the house and the people. I think this book is absolutely wonderful. That's what I'm trying to say.
This is why I can't talk about it, because I have never read a book that has written about grief, like you said, so honestly. It's written in a pure way about one of the worst emotional states you can go through, but also in multiple ways, and how different people react to grief and how that brings out different things in them. But also equally, I think the first half is actually as much about love and different loves you feel. And one, I fell in love with Agnes as a character. I think she's utterly brilliant. She's a woman who knows a lot more that's going on, and actually at various points people say it's very difficult to be around her because she knows what's coming, although as we soon see, sometimes things trick her. every time I think about this book, I want to cry. I think I cried about 7 or 8 times through this book, initially because of the prose alone, but it's just this feeling of emotion, of love and grief that comes off the page so much. I genuinely think, and I don't use this word often, this is an absolute masterpiece. I mean, I love my Guy O'Farrell anyway, but this is like next level O'Farrell.
No, and I am delighted to say that I concur with everything you've said. You know, I think this is a book that will stand the test of time. And yeah, I was bowled over by some of the language in it. Again, it's interesting reading a book like this at a time like this. You know, that there were lots of things in here that chimed particularly because of that, but I don't think my love of this novel has got anything to do with that either. It's really rich, and yeah, I know that I'll be dipping into it and rereading it for years to come.
Yeah, I think it's gone straight into one of my favourite books of all time. I think it's incredible. Hence why it's on my shortlist.
As well.
So the next one's short and sweet, so we can probably talk about it quite short and sweetly. It's Weather by Jenny Offill, which is about a woman who she's been working as a librarian, but she's also working on a podcast which is all about weather change. I think it's a podcast which is all about weather changes. And slowly but surely, climate change kind of comes to the fore in it. And this is what I thought was brilliant about this novel was that it builds anxiety up within you quite well, and you become aware that this big drama of climate change, which starts with a small little thing, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I think it's a novel for our time. However, it has faded from my memory very quickly. When I first read it, it was a 4-star, and now I'm a bit like, maybe less.
I enjoyed it. I found bits of it quite witty as well. It's what I'd describe as a fragmented novel. You know, you read it in little fragments, and I think there's another book on this list that does that better, which we haven't yet come to. And I think it's really
prizes coming there, Mum. There's only 2 left.
I enjoyed it, but I didn't get the wow factor I was expecting.
For me, sadly, it's not on
me either. Yeah.
But ultimately, we have The Dutch House. You talk about it, Mum, because I DNF'd it.
Oh, did you? Okay. We both discussed how we felt about Bel Canto, didn't we, not long ago, which is the only other novel of hers I've read. Didn't particularly like. So I must admit, I was not particularly looking forward to picking this up, which is awful, but you know what it's like when you've read something by an author and you've been a bit lukewarm about it. And I must admit that I really, really enjoyed it. And the house itself, I loved. You know, that it's called The Dutch House, and those descriptions of the house. And I really like the premise of the 2 children who'd grown up there, voyeuristically going and sitting in a car and looking at the house. I'm not going to say any more than that because obviously I don't want to spoil the plot. I found the ending for me was very weak. I was disappointed by it because by, about 100 pages in, I was thinking, oh crikey, this is going to be one of the ones that I put on the shortlist. My shortlist. My
problem was, and this is where I was saying about Claire Lombardo, this had the same effect for me, in the fact that I found some of the writing brilliant, and then lots of it really mundane, and I didn't feel the need for it. I also didn't like the way, and it's a style I don't like, where you flip time zones or time periods in a paragraph, because that throws me. Also, what I have to be aware of is, I was aware that I needed to read this, so I was probably chugging it a little bit too much. And what I will do, if it's on the shortlist, is I'll definitely, anything that's on the shortlist, I'm going to read in full anyway. I'm going to read all of them in full because I want to. I might head back to this on audio because Tom Hanks reads it, and apparently it is incredible. And I think me reading it to myself wasn't quite igniting it in the way that somebody else reading it to me might do. So for that reason, no, it didn't make it for me either. Which means people are going to know which way this next one's going to go, because if they've done the maths, they're no fool. But it's Red at the Bone by Jacqueline Woodson, which I read earlier this year and thought was incredible. It's about a whole family's story going back generations, backwards in time, but also revealing things that have just happened in recent history. I loved how Jacqueline Woodson took us back through these generations and looked at She looks at some very uncomfortable things in this book in all sorts of ways. One particularly for me was the inheritance of trauma and whether generations should or should not take on the inheritance of trauma from their family's past. But I also just thought it was a book very like Girl, Woman, Other, but done in such different ways that gives you a whole spectrum of human life in that amount of pages.
I know, yeah. And I concur with all of that. I thought that it took a really interesting angle, particularly as well on father-daughter relationships. I really like the way she wrote about that. I couldn't put it down. I read it pretty much in one sitting. And I think the structure of it is fascinating, because this is the novel that is written almost in fragments.
Yeah, which I like. I genuinely like that as a style. It's something that I quite enjoy.
Yeah. Well, I think it depends. It depends on who's writing it, doesn't it? And I just thought this was. I thought it was beautiful and very, very clever. And again, I'm still walking around with those characters in my head.
Yeah.
And it's the relationships allied with really good prose, really good structure. Yeah, really strong novel, I think.
And therefore, shock horror.
We both.
So hang on, am I right? Have we got 4 in common?
I think we have. That's a bit of a shock. Hang on a minute, I need to find. Oh, you've been so organised. Why didn't I do that?
It's like I've been doing it for years.
We've got them all in, 4 of them in common.
Yeah.
But I've got Dominicana, whereas you've got Gym Patrol.
Yeah.
And I've got Nightingale Point, whereas you've got How We Disappeared, have we?
Yeah. There's no books really here that I would be sad, bar Fleischmann is in Trouble, if they're on the shortlist. It has been such a good long list.
Oh, and I think the Women's Prize is amazing. There are lots of books here that I wouldn't have read if it hadn't been for them being on that long list. And I just feel really privileged to have been part of that experience. It makes for fantastic reading, and it's testament to what these wonderful women can produce. Yeah.
But the actual announcement will be made tomorrow on Tuesday the 21st at 7:15. Then you will see my reaction to that on this channel at about 7:45, maybe 7:30. We'll see. Me and Mum will be back before the winner is announced on September the 9th, where we will talk about, I'm holding it up like this is that's the one, but we'll be talking about the actual short.
I'll hold mine up as well, hang on. Build the muscles.
Very well, there we go. But we'll talk about the actual shortlist, whatever it may be, and do it in our running order, and then announce our favourites then. So it'll be like a proper countdown and everything. Hopefully the tension will be high, and then we'll find out who's won. But thanks for doing it with me again, Mum.
Oh, thanks for having me. I've just loved every minute of it, and I couldn't wait to talk to you about them. Like, we've been really good, haven't we? We haven't shared our thoughts, and it's so hard not to.
Like I said, I'll be back tomorrow with my response to the shortlist. I'm trying to get Mum on Instagram, because I thought we could do an Instagram live after it's announced and say what we thought, but she's not there yet. But until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Bye.
Bye.